My name is Claire Dawson, and for 22 years, I ran the company my father built with my own two hands, while my mother told everyone at church that my brother was the one holding this family together. I found out how little that ever meant to her on the day we buried my father, standing in the parking lot of Whitmore Funeral Home in a black dress I'd bought for the occasion because I didn't own one, when my mother turned to me before the flowers had even wilted and said, "Preston will be taking over the business, of course. You'll help him get settled in." Help him get settled in, as if I hadn't been the one keeping the lights on at Dawson & Co. Furniture since before Preston knew how to read a balance sheet. As if 22 years of 6 a.m. mornings and missed birthdays and quietly covering for my brother's mistakes were about to be handed to him in a bow while I stood there holding his coat. I want to tell you what happened next, because it isn't the story you think it is. It isn't a simple story of a wronged sister getting her revenge. It's messier than that, and truer than that. And by the end of it, I think you'll understand exactly why I started this channel to tell stories like mine. If you enjoy stories where truth eventually finds its way, consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. Now, let me take you back to where it started. Because to understand what my mother did to me at that funeral, you need to understand what she'd been doing to me my entire life. I was 9 years old the first time I understood that my brother and I were not being raised in the same house, even though we slept 20 feet apart. Preston was born loud. I mean that literally. He came into the world 3 weeks early, red-faced and screaming, and my mother liked to tell that story at every birthday like it was proof of something. "He announced himself," she'd say, laughing, eyes shining. "That boy has always known how to make an entrance." I was born quiet, 2 weeks late apparently, patient even before I understood what patience was. My mother told that story too, but never with the same light in her eyes. "Claire just came when she was good and ready," she'd say, and move on to the next topic before anyone could ask a follow-up question. It's a small thing, I know, a story about being born, but it set the tone for everything that came after. Preston was exciting, I was convenient. My father was different. Robert Dawson built furniture with his hands before he built a company with his name on it, and he had this way of looking at you, really looking, like he was trying to see past whatever you were saying to whatever you actually meant. He noticed things my mother didn't. He noticed that I did my homework at the kitchen table every night without being asked, while Preston needed to be reminded 3 times and still turned it in late. He noticed that I never once complained when I was handed Preston's chores along with my own, because somehow, in our house, my time was always more available than his. But my father worked constantly. Dawson & Co. Furniture started as a 2-man workshop, making custom cabinetry in the back of a rented garage in Millbrook, Ohio, and by the time I was in high school, it had grown into a respected regional furniture manufacturer with 40 employees and a showroom on Main Street. That growth came at a cost, and the cost was that my father was rarely home to counterbalance whatever my mother decided about which of her children deserved more. And my mother decided, early and permanently, that Preston deserved more. I don't think she ever said it in those words. Parents like my mother never do. It's never, "I love him more." It's always something smaller, something deniable. It's whose team got the good snacks. It's whose school project got hung on the refrigerator. It's who got taken along to the special trip to Cleveland to see the Cavaliers play. Because Preston's really going through something right now, Claire, you understand. I always understood. That was the problem. I understood so well, so early, that understanding became my whole personality. By the time I was 16, I was working at Dawson & Co. Furniture after school, sweeping floors and learning the inventory system, while Preston, 2 years older, was failing out of his 2nd semester of community college because he'd rather spend his nights at parties than in a classroom. My mother's response to Preston's failing grades was to hire him a private tutor. My mother's response to my straight A's was silence, because to her, straight A's from me were simply the expected weather, not a storm worth commenting on. I graduated top of class. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied business, and came home every single weekend to help my father at the shop. Because even then, some part of me thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved myself enough, eventually my mother would look at me the way she looked at Preston. She never did, but by then, something had happened that mattered more than my mother's approval. I had fallen in love with the company. I loved the smell of sawdust and varnish in the workshop. I loved watching a rough plank of oak become a dining table that would sit in someone's home for 30 years, holding their holidays and homework and heartbreaks. I loved the logistics of it, the ordering, the scheduling, the way a well-run business was like a piece of furniture itself, built joint by joint, each part depending on the others to hold weight. My father saw that love in me, and he nurtured it in the only way he knew how, by giving me more responsibility than any 20-year-old should probably have. By the time I graduated college, I was managing the entire back office of Dawson & Co. Furniture, payroll, vendor relationships, inventory, half the client accounts. I wasn't just an employee, I was functionally running the operational side of a company that employed 40 families in a town where good jobs were not easy to come by. Preston, meanwhile, had dropped out of college entirely and was working retail at an electronics store, drifting from apartment to apartment, from girlfriend to girlfriend, always one bad decision away from calling my parents for money. And every single time he called, my mother answered. Every single time there was a wire transfer, a co-signed lease, an excuse ready-made. He just needs a little help getting on his feet, Claire. Not everyone finds their path as easily as you did. As easily as I did. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because I certainly have, for 20 years. As if my path had been easy, as if it hadn't been built, plank by plank, out of every ounce of effort I had, specifically because I knew no one was going to hand it to me the way they handed things to my brother. Here's where the story usually turns predictable, and I promise you it's about to get less so. When I was 26, my father made a decision that changed the entire trajectory of my life, though I wouldn't understand the full weight of it for almost 2 more decades. He called me into his office, the same cramped wood-paneled office he'd worked out of since the company was 2 guys and a rented garage, and he told me he wanted to make me an official partner in Dawson & Co. Furniture, not an employee, a partner with equity, with my name on the paperwork. I remember exactly what he said. Claire, I've watched you build half this company without anyone ever telling you that you were building anything. I'm not going to let that go unrecognized anymore. I cried in that office, real, undignified tears, because it was the first time in my entire life that someone in my family had said out loud that they saw what I was doing. But here is the complication, the piece that made everything so much harder than it needed to be. My father asked me not to tell my mother. Not yet, he said, not until the timing was right. He was worried, correctly as it turned out, about how she would react to Preston being left out of an ownership stake he had done nothing to earn. I agreed because I trusted my father, and because some small, tired part of me was relieved to have one thing in this family that belonged to me alone, that my mother couldn't reframe or distribute towards my brother. That secret sat quietly for 16 years. 16 years of me holding equity in a company my mother believed was still entirely my father's, waiting for the right timing that my father kept delaying year after year because he hated confrontation as much as my mother loved chaos. During those 16 years, I became, in every practical sense, the person who ran Dawson & Co. Furniture. My father's health began declining in his late 60s, his heart mostly, along with the accumulated exhaustion of 40 years of manual labor and worry. I took over more and more, negotiating with lumber suppliers when prices spiked, personally intervening when a longtime employee's daughter needed emergency surgery and the insurance company was stalling, redesigning our entire online ordering system myself over a single brutal month when a competitor's website launch threatened to steal our regional market share. And through all of it, my mother's narrative never changed. Preston was getting his life together. Preston had so much potential. Preston, who by then had been given 3 separate management positions within the company, sales floor manager, then logistics coordinator, then eventually, at 38 years old, vice president of operations, a title my father created essentially to give my mother something to brag about at her book club. Preston was, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters in a story like mine, not a bad man. He wasn't cruel to me. He wasn't scheming, not in any way I could see at the time. He was simply a person who had never once in his life had to develop the muscle of earning something because it had always been handed to him, and he had grown entirely comfortable in that arrangement. He'd smile at me in the break room, ask about my weekend, seem genuinely fond of me in his easy, breezy way. He never once, to my face, took credit for something I'd built. He didn't have to. My mother did it for him. I remember a regional business awards ceremony, maybe 12 years ago now, where Dawson & Co. was recognized for our employee retention program, a program I had designed from scratch after watching too many good workers leave for competitors offering marginally better benefits. My mother stood up at that ceremony in front of 200 people and thanked her son Preston, the true heart of this family business. I was sitting 3 tables back. I clapped along with everyone else. I want you to understand what that takes, the specific muscle you build from years of practice, to clap for your own erased work and make your face look like you mean it. Around this point in my life, I want to tell you about someone else who matters to this story, my father's longtime attorney, a careful, quiet man named Harold Ferris, who had handled Dawson & Co.'s legal affairs since the company incorporated. Harold knew about my partnership. Harold, in fact, was the one who eventually convinced my father to formalize something much bigger, something my father had been turning over in his mind for years but never had the courage to finish. But we'll come back to Harold, because right now I need to tell you about the year everything started to crack. 3 years ago, my father's heart finally started failing in earnest. Congestive heart failure, the doctors called it, a slow drowning from the inside that would eventually require either a transplant he was too old for or a long, difficult decline. This is where I want to pause and ask you something, if you're still with me. Have you ever watched a parent get sick and realized in real time exactly who shows up and who doesn't? Because that year taught me more about my family than the previous 30 had. I was at every doctor's appointment. I was the one who learned to read his medication schedule, who argued with his cardiologist about a treatment plan that wasn't working, who sat with him during 3 separate hospital stays while running the company from a folding chair beside his bed, my laptop balanced on my knees. My father, in his weakened, honest state, started talking to me differently during that year. Illness has a way of stripping the performance out of people. He started telling me things he'd never said before, how proud he was of me, how guilty he felt about the secrecy around my partnership, how he worried, genuinely worried, about what would happen to the company and to me after he was gone. Your mother doesn't see you, Claire. I know that. I've always known that. And I let it go on too long because I was a coward about conflict, and I am sorry for that. I didn't cry that time. I think I was too tired to cry. I just held his hand and told him it was okay, even though it wasn't, because that's what you do when your dying father finally apologizes for a lifetime of small failures. You forgive him immediately, whether you've fully processed it or not, because you understand there might not be another chance. During that same difficult year, I started noticing something else, something smaller but persistent, like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. The company's books weren't adding up the way they should have. I want to be careful here, because I'm not an accountant by training, only by necessity, but I had been close enough to Dawson & Co.'s finances for a decade to know its rhythms, and that year the rhythms were off. A vendor account that should have shown a routine payment showed a gap. A line of credit I didn't remember approving had been drawn down significantly. Small discrepancies, individually explainable, but collectively troubling. I brought it up carefully with Preston, framing it as a question rather than an accusation, because I had learned by them that accusing my brother of anything, even gently, resulted in my mother appearing within the hour to defend him against whatever unfair thing I'd said. Preston's answer was vague. "Just some cash flow stuff for the new equipment upgrade, Claire. Don't worry about it. I've got it handled." I didn't fully believe him, but my father was in the hospital, the company needed steady hands, and I made a choice that year that I've thought about many times since. I let it go. I told myself I was choosing family peace over conflict. Looking back, I think I was also just exhausted, and some small, tired part of me didn't want to be the one to cause another problem in a family that already blamed me quietly for everything that went wrong. That was my mistake, not a fatal one, but a costly one, as I'd come to learn. "There's one more thing," Harold said gently, once I'd composed myself. "Your father asked me to review the recent financials before this transition took effect. Claire, I need you to look at something with me." That's when he pulled out the second set of documents, records of 3 transactions over the past 14 months, each one authorized under Preston's operational signature, totaling just over $280,000, routed through a shell consulting arrangement Harold had traced to an old college friend of Preston's, a man who, as far as either of us could determine, had provided no actual consulting services whatsoever. I want to slow down here because this is the part of the story where I have to be honest about my own reaction, because it wasn't the reaction you might expect. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated in some satisfying cinematic way. I felt sick, genuinely sick, sitting in that office realizing that my brother, who I had spent my whole life resenting quietly, while also, somewhere underneath the resentment, loving in the uncomplicated way you love someone you grew up next to, had potentially been siphoning money out of a company that employed 40 families. Families who trusted us, who had mortgages and children's tuition and medical bills riding on Dawson & Co. staying solvent. "Does my mother know about any of this?" I asked Harold. "No," he said. "Your father suspected something wasn't right in his final months, which is part of why he came to me. He didn't have proof yet. He asked me to help you find it, if it existed, once you had the authority to act on it." I sat with that for a long time. My father, dying, weakened, had still found the strength to protect this company and to protect me one last time, in the only way he knew how, quietly and through paperwork, because confrontation had never been his language. I made a decision that day that I still believe was the right one, even though it cost me something. I didn't go to my mother immediately with accusations. I didn't go to Preston in anger. Instead, I asked Harold to help me build an airtight, undeniable financial record first, because I understood something important. In my family, feelings were negotiable and could always be reframed by my mother into whatever story served Preston best. But numbers were not negotiable. Numbers don't have a favorite child. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet, careful work, cross-referencing bank statements, vendor invoices, and the shell company's minimal public records, all while continuing to run the day-to-day operations of Dawson & Co. and grieving my father in whatever stolen moments I could find for it. During those 3 weeks, my mother continued, unaware, to promote Preston at every family gathering, every phone call, every church potluck. "He's really stepping up," she told me over the phone one evening, and I sat there holding documentation of $280,000 in questionable transactions while she praised him for finally growing into himself. I didn't say anything, not yet. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would be undeniable enough that even my mother, with her lifetime of practiced blindness toward her favorite child, would have no choice but to see it. That moment came on a Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks after the funeral, at what was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner at my mother's house.
I brought Harold Ferris with me, which surprised everyone, including, I think, my mother, who assumed he was there for some minor administrative matter related to the will. We sat down after dinner, my mother at the head of the table where my father used to sit, Preston beside her, and me across from both of them with a folder in front of me that felt, in that moment, heavier than anything I'd ever carried in my life. "I need to talk to you both about the estate and about the company," I said, and I want you to know that my voice shook just slightly on the first few words, because 20 years of being trained to make myself small doesn't disappear just because you finally have the truth on your side. I explained my father's second will, the 60% controlling stake, Preston's 20. I watched my mother's face move through disbelief, then something sharper, something close to betrayal. Betrayal, I realized with a strange, sad clarity, not toward Preston, but toward my father, for having done something without her permission. "That can't be right," my mother said. "Robert would have told me." I said, "He told me he was afraid to. He was afraid of how you'd react. I think, looking back, he was right to be afraid." Preston, to his credit, said very little during this part. He looked, more than anything, stunned, a man realizing all at once that the ground under his feet had never been as solid as he'd believed. And then I opened the second folder and told them about the $280,000. I watched my brother's face change in real time, watched 38 years of easy, unearned confidence collapse into something much smaller and much more frightened. "Claire, I hope you can explain," I said, and I meant it. I still meant it, even then. Because right now, what this looks like is embezzlement from a company that pays for 40 families' groceries, Preston. I need you to help me understand how it's actually something else. The explanation, when it came, wasn't a villain's confession. It was messier and sadder than that. Preston had, over the past year, quietly loaned that money to his college friend's failing business, believing he'd recoup it through a consulting partnership that never materialized, using Dawson & Co.'s credit line because his own finances, after years of being financially supported by my parents, were in worse shape than any of us realized. It wasn't premeditated theft, but it was still, undeniably, a serious breach of his authority and a real financial danger to the company, one that could have gone much further if my father's second will hadn't given me the standing to catch it in time. My mother, faced finally with undeniable evidence, did something I genuinely hadn't expected. She didn't defend him this time. She put her head in her hands at that dinner table and cried. And when she finally looked up, she looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years, and said, "What have I done, Claire? What have I done to you all these years?" I didn't have a clean answer for her that night. Some wounds don't resolve in a single dinner table conversation, no matter how satisfying that would be for a story. But it was, I think, the beginning of something.
Here's what happened in the months that followed, because I promised you a satisfying ending, and I intend to give you one, though it's a quieter kind of satisfying than you might expect. I used my controlling stake to make necessary changes at Dawson & Co., but I want to be clear about something. I didn't destroy my brother to do it. I could have. I had every legal right to remove him entirely, to press charges, to let my mother's precious golden child finally face real consequences in the harsh, public way some part of me in my angriest moments wanted him to. I didn't do that. Instead, Preston stepped down from his VP role, not in disgrace exactly, but in honesty, and took a much smaller position managing our supplier relationships, a job that suited his actual strengths. He's genuinely good with people, charming in a way that serves him well when he's not being handed authority he hasn't earned. He agreed to a repayment plan for the misused funds, structured by Harold, that he's still working through today. It's slow. It's humbling for him in a way I think he genuinely needed. My mother and I are not fully healed, and I want to be honest with you about that too, because I don't believe in pretending these stories wrap up in a neat bow overnight. But something did shift. She started asking me questions about the business. Real questions, curious ones, not just Preston-adjacent small talk. She came to me a few months after that dinner and said something I'd waited my entire life to hear.
I think I spent so long trying to make sure Preston felt loved enough. I never noticed I'd made you feel like love was something you had to earn. I'm sorry, Claire. I don't know how to fix 20 years, but I'd like to try. I don't know if I've fully forgiven her. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't always a single decision. Sometimes it's a practice you return to, again and again, on the days you have the strength for it. Some days I have that strength, some days I don't. I think that's allowed. What I do know is this: Dawson & Co. Furniture is stronger today than it's ever been. We've expanded our employee retention program company-wide. We hired an outside financial auditor to review our books quarterly, something that should have happened years ago. I renamed the company's community scholarship fund after my father, and quietly, without telling anyone, after myself as well, in small print at the bottom of the paperwork, because I decided somewhere in the last year that it was allowed for me to acknowledge my own contribution, even if no one else did it for me first. And I finally stopped waiting for my mother's approval to know my own worth. That, more than the 60% stake, more than the vindication of Preston's confession, more than any single dinner table reckoning, that is the actual inheritance my father left me, not the company. The permission, finally, to believe what he'd been telling me all along. I was never invisible. I only felt that way because the people closest to me were looking somewhere else. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to know something. Whatever role you've been assigned in your own family, the responsible one, the overlooked one, the one who holds everything together while someone else gets the credit, that role was never a measure of your worth. It was only ever a measure of what other people were comfortable asking of you, because they trusted you'd say yes. You're allowed to stop saying yes to being invisible. You're allowed to be the one, finally, who gets thanked. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. It truly helps this channel keep telling stories like Claire's. Take care of yourselves this week. Be a little gentler with the people who've been quietly holding things together, and I am sure you already had subscribed to the Silent Victory Story channel, so I'll see you in the next story.